The $40 million weapon that can't stop a $600 drone. The moment the drone won. It started with a flicker, just a blip on radar almost too small to notice. Not a fighter jet, not a missile, just noise the kind analysts filter out 100 times a day. But this one stayed. 40 miles from the city, an operator leaned closer to the screen, watching as the 40 million air defense turret rotated toward a target barely the size of a dinner plate. Software confirmed contact. Commands flowed down the line. The order came through, engage. A glare cut the horizon as the missile launched, then disappeared into cloud. Silence followed, too long, too heavy. When the feed cleared, the dot was still there, dipping lower, changing course, indifferent. The shot had failed. The most expensive shield of the modern battlefield had just been outsmarted by something built in a garage for the price of a phone. On the ground, a detonation the size of a trash can tore through a supply truck on the perimeter. A single FPV drone, built from commercial parts, held together with tape, had slipped through what should have been one of the most secure air defense grids in existence. A one-time use flying camera had just outsmarted a machine that cost more than most jet fighters. That explosion was small, but everyone who saw it felt the bigger impact. The realization that absolute technological dominance was an illusion. The frontline crew knew it instantly, years of training and billions in procurement gone in a single burst of flame. Engineers designing countersystems around the world would spend months dissecting those few seconds, trying to understand how a toy beat a fortress. The drone itself wasn't special. A homemade build GoPro camera, lithium battery, a 3D printed casing, and a small explosive payload. But what it represented was massive. For centuries, armies have trusted the idea that spending more produces safety, that complexity equals superiority. Yet time after time, history proves otherwise. On that day, the message was as clear as the smoke rising from the wreckage: price doesn't measure power. To see why, you have to rewind. Because every era of warfare has watched this same movie play out with different actors, where the expensive, the advanced, and the seemingly invincible meet something smaller, smarter, and far cheaper. Think about it: tanks that fell to hand-launched rockets, fortified castles broken by homemade cannons, billion-dollar ships scared of swarming speedboats. War keeps revealing the same flaw: too much faith in hardware, not enough in imagination. That anti-drone battery on the hill with its sleek targeting optics and AI-assisted radar is only the latest chapter in a very old story. The pattern always begins the same way. One side invests everything in control, better armor, longer range, greater firepower. The other side, unable to match resources, turns to invention. They look for simplicity that breaks the system. Sometimes it's desperation. Usually it's necessity. And necessity, more than funding, rewrites battlefields. So here's the question that drives this story: why do expensive weapons keep losing to cheap ones? It isn't luck and it isn't incompetence, it's the structure of war itself. Technology reaches for perfection, reality punishes predictability. The moment a weapon becomes dominant, the clock starts ticking. Somewhere, someone is already working on the cheaper answer. That night, the drone operator launched from a garage miles away. A teenager only a few years out of high school, following video tutorials that once taught racing tricks on YouTube. He didn't need an airbase or satellite link. He needed only line of sight, a headset, and steady thumbs. His adversary was a multinational defense network worth tens of billions. Both existed in the same airspace for 40 seconds. That's all it took to expose how outdated our confidence really is. For everyone watching that feed, the shock wasn't technological, it was psychological. The drone's hit proved that modern warfare had entered a state of asymmetry so extreme that cost itself had become irrelevant. Power wasn't about who could build the biggest weapon, it was about who could adapt faster. In the weeks after, videos of similar strikes circulated online, grainy clips of cheap drones diving toward armored vehicles, bunkers, and missile batteries. Each one less surprising than the last. Because once you see it happen, you start recognizing the pattern everywhere. History doesn't move in straight lines, it loops. So tonight, we trace that loop. From medieval rebels turning wagons into moving fortresses, to resistance fighters weaponizing bottles of fuel, to guerrillas outrunning tanks with shoulder-fired rockets. Every age has its underdog invention that rewired the rules of dominance. The $600 drone is simply the newest reminder. War has never been fair, but it's always been creative. And that creativity born in corners, basements, and battlefields is what keeps dismantling the myth that money can buy invincibility. The moment the drone won wasn't about a single explosion. It was about every army in every era realizing that innovation never obeys a budget. Section 1: The Timeless Pattern. War has always been a competition between invention and inertia. Every generation steps onto the battlefield believing its weapons edge closer to perfection. But the truth is simpler: perfection never lasts long because someone always finds a way to break it for less. If you map history through its armies, you'll see the same rhythm. One side pours fortune and faith into a tool meant to end all wars. The other side studies it, learns its weaknesses, and invents something crude but clever. Often, the tool of triumph isn't forged in a government laboratory. It's built in a village forge or improvised on the spot when the official equipment fails to deliver. You could call it asymmetry, but it's really physics in human form. When one side grows heavy with armor, the other side learns to move light and fast. When the strong build walls, the weak invent ladders. The titans of each era make the same mistake. They assume their advantage is permanent. The ancient world offered the first reminders. Bronze shields met sling stones, projectiles that cost nothing and yet could shatter a soldier's skull through sheer velocity. David and Goliath wasn't just a story, it was strategy condensed into myth. The wealthy armies of antiquity built chariots, then elephants, then siege towers. Each time, somebody with fewer resources found a simpler countermeasure. Fire, terrain, a shift in formation, or just the courage to run straight at the gap nobody defended. Fast forward to the Middle Ages. Knights in plate armor dominated the battlefield for centuries, an entire economy built around maintaining their superiority. But the first appearance of gunpowder, crude, unreliable, even dangerous to fire, undid all of it. A peasant with a hand cannon could now wound a noble who had spent his life training for combat. The math was humiliating. One weapon worth a few days of wages neutralized a lifetime of investment. Technology democratized lethality. It made hierarchy irrelevant. That's the pivot point we keep revisiting. Whenever war becomes too expensive for most to join, someone figures out how to make it cheap again. And from that moment on, the world changes. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the crossbow created panic for the same reason the drone does today. It required minimal training, ignored armor, and could be produced in workshops rather than forges. It was so effective that the church itself tried to ban it, calling it inhumane. Not because it was cruel, but because it erased the difference between the trained knight and the commoner. That moral outrage disguised a deeper fear, the loss of control. Societies that rely on status fear level playing fields, and war has always been the great leveler. The Hussites of Bohemia would soon prove that on a massive scale, turning farm carts into mobile fortresses to defeat mounted crusaders. But even before them, history had whispered the warning: small resources force big innovations. By the dawn of the industrial age, the pattern had matured into a formula. Massive states built expensive arsenals, while outnumbered forces used agility and bricolage to compensate. Muskets replaced bows, yet the principle stayed constant. Every new invention that promised dominance lasted just long enough for someone to design a workaround in a shed, with fewer materials and less bureaucracy. Militaries, meanwhile, struggle to adapt not because they lack intelligence, but because institutions move slower than necessity. Bureaucracy favors predictability, war rewards surprise. When strategic planning depends on budget cycles and procurement charts, the act of improvisation becomes a threat instead of a skill. The other side, unbound by these rules, experiments freely. And the first time one of their experiments works, entire doctrines collapse. Philosophers like to say armies prepare to fight the last war. In reality, they preserve the last comfort, the illusion that power can be engineered into existence. The wealthier the army, the greater that illusion. The poorer, the more desperate to answer innovation with improvisation. And in war, desperation breeds creativity faster than research grants. The 20th century industrialized this logic. Massive armored vehicles, bombers, and navies demanded staggering investment. Yet in nearly every conflict, somewhere on the battlefield, a handmade or improvised device delivered more effect per dollar than entire government arsenals. Technology advances, but vulnerability never disappears, it simply shifts shape. We like to imagine history as a sequence of breakthroughs, bronze to iron, gunpowder to rifles, aircraft to missiles. But these aren't linear steps upward, they're reactions, each one responding to how the previous advantage was undermined by cheaper ingenuity. The story of progress in war is really a series of humiliations for those who believed progress could be purchased. Behind every celebrated invention stands a future enemy already sketching a counter on a scrap of paper. That's why this pattern isn't just tactical, it's psychological. It punishes arrogance and rewards imagination. Empires rise when they innovate and fall when they confuse wealth for wisdom. If you trace these inflection points, you'll notice they arrive quietly. A soldier experimenting with a new firing formation. A craftsman modifying a weapon no one takes seriously. A group of workers turning farm equipment into armor. The big picture only becomes visible afterward, when historians connect the dots and realize the revolution had been hiding in plain sight. This is the timeless paradox of war. The tools meant to secure dominance always end up teaching the underdog how to defeat them. Perfection breeds complacency, success invites imitation, and the cycle renews itself endlessly. Each generation writes new manuals on how to restore superiority, and each generation learns too late that superiority is temporary. Centuries before modern drones challenged anti-aircraft systems, that same dynamic had already unfolded on muddy European fields. A religious rebellion discovered that defense could also move, that peasants could outthink knights, and that wagon wheels could reshape military history. The lesson was simple but eternal: flexibility beats expense. When Jan Žižka's men hitched their carts into defensive circles and mounted primitive cannons on them, they weren't just resisting crusaders, they were proving the rule we still confront today. War isn't a contest of who spends more, it's the story of who adapts better. Section 2: The Hussite Revolution. Bohemia, early 15th century. Europe is fractured by religion, empire, and class. In one corner of that chaos, a blind commander named Jan Žižka stands before an army made up mostly of peasants and townsmen, people who were never meant to win wars. Against them marched the crusaders of the Holy Roman Empire, knights plated in steel, banners flying, horses armored, confident that faith and finance guarantee victory. They've faced rebellions before, but never like this, because Žižka and his men aren't planning to fight on the knights' terms. The Hussites lack heavy cavalry, proper artillery, or even uniforms. What they have instead are tools of labor: horses, wagons, hammers, and carts, objects of daily survival. Under Žižka's mind, these turn into weapons. He orders the carts reinforced with planks and iron, mounts small cannons on their flanks, and chains the wagons together in rings known as Wagenburgs, literally, wagon castles. Inside these improvised fortresses, his soldiers position crossbowmen and gunners armed with early hand cannons. When the first battle begins, everything about it defies convention. The crusading knights charge forward, confident that mass and momentum will break the rebels. But instead of open formation, they crash into a wall of wagons. Their horses flounder under musket fire and shrapnel from Terrasness and Hofnitzi, short howitzer-like cannons firing from beneath rough wooden covers. The sound is deafening, closer to thunder than battle. Smoke veils the hillside. Crusaders stumble into choke points between chained wagons where Hussite infantry lie in wait with flails and pikes. Within minutes, the unstoppable cavalry splinters, trapped in terrain of the rebels' own design. Žižka's army wins not with numbers or armor, but with rearrangement. He's taken the strongest symbols of medieval power, speed and shock, and neutralized them with geometry and timing. The wagon has become both castle and cannon platform, something between fortress and tank. No one in Europe has ever seen battle wagons used this way. Ordinarily, wagons serve to carry supplies or shield a retreat, not as an offensive weapon. Yet in Žižka's hands, they redefine the battlefield. His Wagenburgs can be rapidly assembled, defensively impenetrable, and then opened for counterattack through carefully placed gaps. When the enemy withdraws, the wagons roll forward, turning defense into pursuit. This setup democratizes war. Peasants who once stood helpless against a mounted knight now fire into their visors from behind cover. Artisans loading powder and shot into cannons become artillery crews overnight. Žižka establishes routines: wagon captains, standard formations, designated flanks. A village craft evolves into organized warfare. Critics at the time dismissed the tactic as primitive, a barricade fight unworthy of professional armies. Yet those words echo centuries later in every war where improvisation defeats prestige. The power of the Wagenburg lies not in sophistication but repetition. It allows outnumbered fighters to hold ground, regroup, and advance methodically. For 15 years, the Hussites repel wave after wave of crusades. Reports from invaders describe near supernatural defense networks, mobile fortresses appearing overnight on open fields, muskets igniting faster than anyone thought possible, peasants outmaneuvering cavalry trains since childhood. Each campaign ends with the same shock: the empire's expense buys no guarantee of triumph. From a distance, these battles look medieval. Up close, they preview modernity. The Hussite Wars introduce combined arms coordination long before anyone names it as doctrine. Crossbows cover artillery reloads, gunmen wedge between spear lines, wagons move like modular armor, the first mechanized units in concept if not in engine. Žižka's genius isn't theoretical. He spends every hour on field experiments. Blindness in one eye, later both, forces him to command by sound and instinct. He standardizes wagon dimensions so repairs and replacements can be made quickly. Crews learn by rhythm: reload, fire, reposition. Every wagon becomes a node in a larger machine, and the sum is greater than any individual knight. The meaning goes beyond tactics. The Hussite movement stems from the execution of the preacher Jan Hus, a revolt tied to faith and nationalism. But its military form transforms rebellion into revolution. For the first time, ordinary citizens armed with cheap weapons and courage can dictate terms to Europe's aristocracy. A spiritual uprising becomes a logistical one. The psychological shock ripples far past Bohemia. Neighboring states scramble to imitate what they mocked. Armories start producing smaller field guns, city militias practice defensive wagon circles, the cost barrier to entering war drops overnight. Everyone learns that effectiveness doesn't depend on wealth, it depends on how intelligently you reuse what you already have. In Žižka's campaigns, the lesson is visible in every spent powder charge. Technology is neutral until imagination claims it. The same gunpowder nobles use for sieges turns into an equalizer in the hands of a blacksmith. The same wagon that carried grain to market transforms into an armored battery. The same social order that ranked men by armor thickness collapses the moment gunfire ignores armor altogether. By the mid-143s after Žižka's death, the Hussite armies fragment absorbed into shifting alliances. But the doctrine they forge lives on. Hofnitze, their name for those short cannons, evolves linguistically into howitzer. Wagon fortifications inspire later engineers who design moving artillery platforms. Generals studying their records note that controlled mobility paired with firepower consistently beats traditional cavalry assaults. It's the birth certificate of mechanized warfare written in wood and iron. More crucially, it exposes a truth armies still struggle to embrace. Logistics can be weaponized. The Hussites proved that efficiency, a faster reload, a standardized wagon part, and easier repair can outweigh sheer destructive power. Those principles echo through every revolution in military design, from interchangeable musket parts to assembly line tanks, from guerrilla adaptability to drone swarms guided by hobbyist code. And within that revelation sits the paradox that underpins this entire story. The Hussites succeed because they embrace imperfection. Their wagons aren't flawless, they creak, splinter, get stuck in mud, yet that very imperfection makes them adaptable. You can fix a wagon with nails and rope in minutes. When one breaks, it becomes spare parts. When a cannon misfires, another fires faster. Nothing relies on precision manufacturing. The system endures because each component is expendable. Centuries later, engineers will design modern vehicles and weapons with the opposite philosophy: maximum precision, minimal tolerance for deviation. Žižka would have laughed. Perfection, he'd say, is what kills you first. Because the moment your system stops allowing improvisation, your enemy starts exploiting it. The Hussite Revolution is more than a historical footnote. It's the first industrial age concept born in a pre-industrial world, decentralized resilience. An army of laborers replaces hierarchy with process, capitalizes on cheap reproducibility, and invents mobility without machinery. It turns constraint into power, the purest expression of asymmetric warfare. And though history books focus on its theology or politics, its real legacy is mechanical. Every army that ever fortified a position, mounted guns on vehicles, or synchronized mixed-range weapons owes something to those farmers behind their wagons. In hindsight, Europe underestimated what it witnessed. The wars ended, borders realigned, but the idea escaped. Once simplicity demonstrates superiority, it never disappears, it migrates. From the hills of Bohemia, the logic travels forward in time, waiting to reappear wherever expensive certainty collides with desperate creativity. Because the pattern doesn't stop. A few centuries later, the same logic reemerges, metal replacing wood, engines replacing horses, industry replacing craftsmanship, but the imbalance remains. Once again, great powers believe that machinery ensures dominance, and once again, ordinary fighters prove otherwise. They'll rediscover the hard way that courage and contrivance still outrun budgets. The next revolution in simplicity waits in snow and flame, inside a weapon that costs less than a meal but burns through millions: the Molotov cocktail. Section 3: The Molotov Cocktail and the Fall of the Tank Myth. Winter 1939. A column of Soviet tanks grinds through snow toward the Finnish border, engines growling under mounds of frost. To Moscow, the invasion is a show of dominance, massive, mechanized, unstoppable. Rows of T-26 tanks, icons of modern warfare, glint like beetles under the pale sun. The Soviet command believes nothing smaller than an artillery battery could stop them. But inside those forests, silence hides something far cheaper. Finnish soldiers kneel behind drifts of snow, wool coats blending into the landscape. They're shivering, under-equipped, and outnumbered nearly 4-to-1. Most don't have anti-tank weapons. The few field guns they possess freeze between shots. So they turn to what they do have: bottles, gasoline, and desperation. In field journals, one platoon writes about experimenting with makeshift firebombs. Glass bottles half filled with fuel, corked with rags fitted for quick ignition. When they throw, the results are messy and unpredictable. But when it works, it's terrifying. The Soviets roll forward in formation, believing infantry in loose snow can't threaten armor. Then a burst of flame erupts against a tank vent. Within seconds, fire snakes through the grates and spreads inside the hull. One vehicle halts, another backs into a ditch. Crews scramble out, their silhouettes consumed by heat shimmer. The Finns realize they've found the weakness: the tank's respiratory system. Feed it fire and it chokes on its own air. News of these improvised weapons spreads through units in whispers. They nickname it Molotov cocktail. a mocking signature directed at Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who had claimed Soviet planes were only dropping food parcels, not bombs. Each bottle, they joke, is a drink to go with your meal. Crude humor wraps a deadly truth. The most advanced armor division in the world is now vulnerable to liquor bottles and lighter fluid. Tactically, the Molotov is absurdly simple. Gasoline, kerosene, or tar for adhesion, a rag as fuse, a quick light before throw. The chemical reaction costs less than a mark, but the effect is catastrophic. The adhesive flames cling to vents, optics, and exhaust ports, forcing steel monsters to suffocate. Crews either burn or flee. Numbers mean nothing when the battlefield itself turns into a fire trap. Each successful hit echoes through command channels. Soviet generals order adjustments, longer tank columns, infantry support, better ventilation, but adaptation lags behind reality. The Red Army still trains by doctrine written for open plains, not forests where ambushers melt into snowbanks. The Finnish defense forces exploit this relentlessly. They break the tank formations into isolated vehicles, surround them with ski patrols, and attack from close range. Every successful ambush costs Moscow more prestige than resources. The irony runs deep. Tanks had been the miracle weapon of 20th century warfare, the physical manifestation of industrial supremacy. The Great War's muddy stalemates gave birth to them. Interwar theorists idolized them. To own tanks was to own destiny. Knights had their armored horses, empires now had armored engines. Yet all it took to wound that illusion was a hand-thrown flame. In those woods, the myth of mechanical invulnerability froze, burned, and shattered. Eyewitness accounts from Soviet survivors reveal more than tactical failure. They describe fear. Many recall hearing the hiss of ignition before seeing anything. Fire, unpredictable and intimate, replaced artillery as the dominant emotion. You can hear shells, you can anticipate explosions. Fire on your hull erases that predictability. It envelops, crawls, consumes. Soldiers who trusted in armor suddenly felt exposed, trapped inside the very machine that was supposed to save them. Symbolically, the Molotov cocktail inverted everything military progress claimed to achieve. A bottle crafted in a basement now dictated how nations built their tanks. Crews demanded better ventilation systems, external fuel seals, flame suppressors. Engineers redesigned turret hatches and rear armor. Each improvement cost exponentially more than the problem it tried to solve. A 5-cent rag forced multi-million-dollar redesigns. The psychological dimension was even more transformative. The illusion of overwhelming firepower cracked. If a foot soldier could destroy a tank alone, then hierarchy itself became negotiable. Commanders could no longer rely on linear superiority. Every encounter could turn into chaos from a single spark. The lesson was crude but direct. Force is only as strong as its weakest detail, and details can be decoded by those without resources. Across the world, resistance movements took note. During World War II, the same weapon reappears everywhere. Soviet partisans behind German lines, Polish insurgents during the Warsaw Uprising, Spanish Republicans, Greek resistance cells. Each uses a variation, different fuels, thicker glass, sometimes attached chemicals for smoke or delayed burn. The cocktail becomes a handshake shared among underdogs, an announcement that no occupation, however mechanized, is safe from human ingenuity. Meanwhile, nations at the industrial core respond predictably with scale. They build heavier armor, flamethrower tanks, self-sealing lines, and flame-retardant coating. Every adaptation costs fortunes. Each one buys temporary confidence, never permanence. The curve starts again, investment chasing creativity, inventiveness exploiting blind spots. What makes the Molotov story enduring isn't the chemistry, it's the literacy of observation. The Finns didn't invent fire. They recognized where ventilation sat, how armor angled when optics fogged, and from that comprehension crafted a tool perfectly tuned to the machine's habits. It's the same intelligence that centuries earlier turned wagons into fortresses and centuries later mounts explosives on drones. Warfare's innovation rarely revolves around invention, it's about interpretation. By early 194, Soviet forces adapt just enough to grind forward and force peace. But the damage to prestige is permanent. Western observers note that Finland's resistance, armed with little more than rifles and flame bottles, inflicted disproportionate losses on a mechanized giant. The world sees the strategic cost of arrogance quantified, millions in steel undone by playground simplicity. The war propaganda tries to spin it, Molotov cocktails, as anomalies, lucky strikes. Yet their legacy proves otherwise. Post-war conflicts copy the tactic again and again. In Spain's civil war, guerrillas refine its deployment against lighter vehicles. In 1956 Hungary, crowds used the same design to set Soviet tanks ablaze in Budapest streets. Over and over, civilians transform household objects into equalizers. The barrier between soldier and citizen blurs. The bottle's simplicity also carries symbolic weight in politics and protest. Beyond battlefields, it becomes shorthand for rebellion. Students, insurgents, revolutionaries all inherit its image. Because a tool that brings down tanks carries mythology, proof that material imbalance doesn't guarantee submission. In every flicker of that burning liquid lives the same defiance the Hussites once embodied behind their wagons, the insistence that adaptation trumps authority. By the mid-20th century, the weapon's design stabilizes. Manuals quietly circulate among resistance groups, precise ratios of fuel to thickener, the ideal throw distance, the timing of ignition. Armies begin to study them not to use but to defend against them. Flame screens, mesh protection, and reactive armor all trace their lineage to trying to suppress a bottle. The entire evolution of armored warfare pivots around neutralizing what costs less than a meal. From a technological standpoint, the Molotov cocktail marks the moment when mechanization meets its natural limit. You can stack armor, layer materials, add shields, but you can't prevent the human eye from noticing where your vents are. That observant creativity is free and you can't shoot it down with money. Tanks remain formidable pieces of engineering, but ever since the finished snowfields, they carry the memory of fragility inside their design. For the soldiers who used those first bottles, victory wasn't about numbers, it was about restoring agency. Their improvisation turned necessity into narrative. Each flame burst broadcast that survival favors flexibility. That message passes from generation to generation, encoded not in blueprints but in instinct. Study your enemy's expensive solution, then find the cheapest way to break it. The fall of the tank myth didn't end armored warfare, it humanized it. Every fire mark on burnt steel reminds designers that complexity invites counterplay. The same hubris that forged those engines ensures someone somewhere is crafting the next bottle of flames, or the next equivalent coated in silicon and rotors. Decades later, soldiers facing guerrillas with RPGs will quote the same misunderstanding Soviet officers voiced in 1939. How did something so crude hit something so advanced? The answer never changes, because in war the equation always balances toward creativity.